All right. So, do you think a mask makes you more attractive? That is the subject of tonight's Thursday study review. Beyond the beauty of occlusion, medical masks increase facial attractiveness more than other face coverings. It's review night. Let's go. Okay, so this actually comes by special request, actually, from a viewer to look at this particular study that was released recently, published in the journal Cognitive Research, Principles and Implications, and as always, it will be linked for you. This one is open access, so it's actually not behind a paywall, so anybody can go look at it. Needless to say, I think this is another good study that, while well-intentioned and actually it asks an interesting question, though not necessarily a significantly important question, it's poorly done. Let's just put it that way. I don't think very highly of this particular study, because it's not as generalizable as you would like. Usually with studies, you're looking for patterns that you can generalize to the larger thing, and that's hard to do with when you're dealing with humans, because we're so variable between individuals that it's hard to characterize things to an entirety of society. Goddamn microphone. I am so sorry, folks, that I am not savvy with this microphone and I'm still having issues with it. I apologize. There's not too much I can do. I may either get a new microphone or I need an engineer. Because I noticed one of you all pointed out that I am not an engineer, and that's how you know. And you are correct. I am not an engineer. In the slightest, I am a scientist for a living. Anyway, so let's get into this. The sanitary mask effect, Miyazaki and Kawa in Japanese Psychological Research 2016, is the finding that medical face masks prompt an image of disease and thus result in lower ratings of facial attractiveness of the wearer. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, medical masks have been found to increase attractiveness, although this could have been the general effect of occlusion. To further explore this issue, female participants were presented with a series of male faces of low or high attractiveness that were occluded with a medical mask, a cloth mask, a book, or not occluded, and asked them to rate them on attractiveness. The results show that faces were considered as most attractive when they were covered with medical masks, and significantly more attractive when occluded with cloth masks than when not occluded. Contrary to the expectation, base attractiveness did not interact with the type of occlusion, suggesting that this is not simply due to occlusion of negative features. The present findings are contrary to the sanitary mask effect, and explanations in the terms of social desirability and the association of medical masks with caregiving professions is explored. So, this is the fun part about it, is that what we're getting into here. And we will, again, try to give you something interesting. And don't forget, tonight, for local supporters, the live chat on this article and other things. I will also wrap into it the other article on the pantyhose that was out this morning, to talk about that too, if you want to talk about that silly study. Oh my gosh. And get into that. Whoops, I'm on the wrong page here. And we can get into that, but that will be at 9 p.m. Central Time, because I am at an event when you're seeing this, probably in a different part of the area. So I will be back, though, by the time 9 p.m. rolls around. 9 p.m. Central Time for the locals exclusive chat. Anyway. As a result of the outbreak of the coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19, pandemic, there has been sharp increase in the demand for protective face masks globally and to prevent the spread of the virus. Despite concerns about masks eliciting a false sense of security, research shows they are paramount importance to help to reduce the spread of COVID-19, which is reflected in government policy worldwide. You notice there's one study here cited from 2020 that masks would reduce it. Not saying, again, anything against the efficacy of masks, YouTube. I'm just pointing out that they are citing a study. Notwithstanding the medical benefits, the use of masks carries costs. Evidence suggests wearing masks induces perceived discomfort. Why not just say it induces discomfort? Because they are uncomfortable. Impairs vocal communication, at least in my experience, they are uncomfortable. I am the anecdotal experience right here. But anyway, impairs vocal communication and may be a barrier to social interaction. Furthermore, masks prevent crucial face-to-face interactions between newborns and their primary attachment figures. Couldn't you just say parents or guardians? Anyway, which could impede early bonding. Finally, research shows masks impair recognition of emotions, with participants reporting lower confidence and greater patterns of confusion. Overall, research on the side effects of masks has significant implications for day-to-day life, in which recognizing emotions and clear communication are a key to interpersonal interaction. Let's see, they're pointing out in this section that face coverings are a rare sight in Western nations such as the UK, which is where the study was done. But they're pointing out in other parts of the world, such as in Muslim communities, they do part of their culture with hijabs and burqas. They will wear things that do at times partially cover the face, so it's a different thing there. Medical masks, sometimes referred to as surgical or sanitary masks, are routinely used for health reasons in collectivist countries such as Japan, where people have enhanced personal hygiene practices. Masks are also customary in China as protection from air pollution, despite concerns about their efficacy. And that's all well and good. That doesn't necessarily mean that we want to have a lot of masks in Western countries. So that's the other thing there, and just a point to make there. So one of the things, I have a lot of little things highlighted in this section, but in general, one of the things you'll see with any study, or you should see with any study, is that they go through a little bit of the backstory of the literature and things that have been talked about related to the question they are attempting to answer or add to or build upon or what have you. You will see a whole section that is just a bit of background and things going on there that would be relevant. And what they point out here is actually the contrast that you saw me read off in the abstract. The first study they talk about is that Miyazaki and Kawara study, 2016, with the common belief among Japanese women that wearing masks increase one's attractiveness. But in that initial study, they found that that's not true. The authors found that faces occluded by a medical mask were perceived as less attractive than those that were not, regardless of the base attractiveness, which they termed the sanitary mask effect. So that's the 2016 study. And how they explained that in the 2016 paper that this one cites is that it's in terms of medical masks acting as a primer of disease. So you might think somebody is sick when they're approaching with one, and that's kind of like, oh, I want to stay away from the sick person kind of thing is the idea there. So that makes people seem less attractive, which makes logical sense to me that might be the case. Overall, these findings suggest medical masks are linked to poor health and individuals wearing them seen as less attractive. So that's what they get into there. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, more research has been conducted in this area. Patel et al. 2020 investigated the influence of facial occlusion with medical masks on the judgments of facial attractiveness in the United States. Without reference to Miyazaki and Kawara's 2016 research, which is to say they didn't reference it in that 2020 study. They didn't reference the 2016 study and the 2020 study. So Patel et al. Found that unattractive and average attractive faces were rated as significantly more attractive when in the mask compared to unmasked condition. So in other words, on one study they found that the masking is negative, on the other study they found the masking is positive. So that's totally different. That's the contradiction that prompts them to do this research that they're pointing out. In related research, Olivia LaRosa looked at the Oliveira La Rosa et al. Looked at the effect of multiple individual differences on, among other variables, illness and social desirability perceptions of faces with or without medical masks. They found that people shown as masked faces were generally considered more socially desirable than unmasked faces. Furthermore, they found that masked faces were also rated as more likely to be ill than unmasked faces, which supports Miyazaki and Kawara's findings. One possible explanation for these counterintuitive results is that participants formed a more implicit association between medical masks and illness, but a deliberative link between medical masks and social desirability, which may reflect the role of social norms in attractiveness judgments. Which is to say, how are perceptions changing as we are doing more masking is the kind of thing there, that's the kind of saying that we're getting into with this stuff, which is to say, as people are obscuring the face more, does it become more socially acceptable? On the other hand, what they're ignoring in all this is kind of what they cited early in the introduction, that, there's actually a lot of problems with psychological development and emotion reading and socialization and what have you when you're covering your face all the time, a key component of your face, and you just have the eyes. Some people can't just intuit emotions off a person's eyes. Other people can't. Some people are very good at that. But you don't allow for the development of that, and you can have some significant mental health issues, according to some published papers in psychology as it relates to masks. So that's the interesting part there that one should consider in these kinds of things. The medical face mask has, in fact, become an icon of medical professionals' fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, as illustrated by the artwork of Nathan Wyburn. Thus, the social desirability of medical mask wearers could potentially offset the association with disease in the assessment of attractiveness of faces with medical masks on. So, yeah, there's that kind of tension there. Is it suddenly becoming more of a socially accepted thing and norm that, you can wear a mask all the time? And, personally, I don't care if somebody's wearing a mask around me. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. That's not what I rate a person on at all. So, and I'll get back to that in a second, because there's something about you remember what I said at the beginning about generalization? Something key about this study to point out. In this study, the sanitary mask effect disappeared. Yeah, okay, and that's about the Kamatani 2021 study they're talking about here. That has to do with all that. Okay, so present study, so this paragraph is all about what are they doing. Present study sets out to answer a number of questions related to facial attractiveness and occlusion that have arisen from previous research, in particular from Miyazaki and Kawara's findings. Firstly, how universal and robust is the sanitary mask effect? Does it generalize to the UK population during a global pandemic? Keep that first one in particular in mind, because I guarantee you they can't generalize the results. They can try, but they can't. Secondly, how do cloth face masks affect judgments of facial attractiveness? Reusable cloth masks are much more common sight in the UK at the moment, and so does the increased familiarity have an impact on the assessment of the wearer. Finally, acceptance of mask wearing is not universal, and it was explored whether attitudes toward mask wearing impact people's assessment of the mask wearer. To investigate these questions, the present study employed a 2x4 within subjects design with independent variables, base attractiveness, and type of occlusion, and the dependent variable is facial attractiveness, which is to say you have a statistical relationship there. Participants were asked to rate the attractiveness of faces previously rated as unattractive or attractive, low versus high base attractiveness, when occluded with a medical mask, occluded with a cloth face mask, occluded with a control object, or not occluded. Now, as you may have heard me say many times, check the methods. Always check the methods if you're interested in a study, because checking the methods gives you a sense of whether or not the conclusions are supported. Because if the method is good, then it will be supportive of the conclusions. But in this case, this is another one of those examples where the method doesn't support the conclusions, and it doesn't support any attempt to be generalizing, and I will show you exactly why. Because this is something about people rating each other. The sample is important. In particular, the sample is important. Given that there were more comparisons being made here than the simple mask-no mask comparison, the number of participants is increased to 43. 43 people. I don't know the population of the UK off the top of my head. 43 people. Thus, 43 Cardiff University undergraduate psychology students were recruited on the School of Psychology's experimental management system. The study was only available to female participants. One participant was excluded due to arbitrary responding. In the final pool of participants, most, 40, indicated their age as being between 18 and 24 years. The majority of participants, 40, also identified as white. Do you see what the problem is there with trying to generalize it to the entire UK population? You're talking about college students. These are how college students rate facial attractiveness, not how the general public would. College students are not necessarily representative at all of the rest of the general public, given that they're in typically the very isolated space of academia. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand it with psychology, and I actually did this when I went through a psychology course. It was a way for me to get course credit, was to participate in somebody's experiment. And so I did. But they here picked 43 students. It was a sample of convenience for them to get psychology students or students in psychology classes to participate in this experiment. But these are 18 to 24-year-olds who have you know, who have with their age different things. They're not representative of the broader population of the UK. And so that's why I have to say right off the bat, you can't generalize these results to the rest of the public. You cannot generalize these results to the rest of the UK public because you are talking about college students primarily and how they react. And the social sciences in particular is very context dependent with the sample and the number of people, what's the range and the demographics covered and the whole works. Yeah, they're very dependent on that. This is not necessarily generalizable. Now, if you repeat it with a much larger sample and a much wider age range and, all the rest of it, and you still get this result, then great. Absolutely great. It's harder to do that, though, with a psychology study, precisely because of the fact that you then have to go through internal review board procedures at whatever university and ethics and all this kind of stuff. It takes forever sometimes. Doing it with college students is a much easier lift. But that does make it immediately difficult to say anything about whether or not this would generalize to the broader public. That face masks are actually more attractive. You can say that college students may find you more attractive if you're wearing a face mask, but they've also been exposed to the thing for goodness knows how many years now of having to wear face masks all the time. And being told that you have to because that's the only way you can protect people, and you're not a good citizen if you don't protect people. And we'll get into that more in a second. So the Chicago Face Database, version 2.0.3, and yes, there is such a thing as the Chicago Face Database. All images were frontal portraits. The faces varied in race and physical attractiveness, and 20 most attractive and 20 least attractive faces based on previous ratings included in the CFD were selected. Who rated them, and how is somebody considered attractive? I'm sure that's in here somewhere, but how was it rated in the CFD for them to pick from? Only neutral facial expressions were chosen. While faces differed in hairstyle, none had piercings, glasses, beards, or other potential occluding features or confounding factors. So in other words, you didn't account for the other things that might make a face less attractive to begin with, or more attractive to some. That depends on your preference, right? And of course, how do you define neutral? How do you define a neutral facial expression? Also, do those definitions match between your definition of neutral and your participants' definitions of neutral? Questions I ask, really. These are questions I ask. One cloth mask. Okay, the edges of the occluders were edited to make sure they blended in well with the rest of the face. Thus, there were 160 different stimuli, i.e. 4 different faces with no facial occluder, a medical mask, cloth mask, and book occluder as depicted in Figure 1. We'll get to that image in a second, but what they're saying is they have 160 images they showed to people, because to their sample of 40-ish college students, to get this to work. So let's see. Experiment was set up on PsychoPie, and run in February 2021, 7 months after wearing masks became mandatory in the UK. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions, it was conducted online via pavlovia.org, and thus completed on participants' own devices. Participants were asked to complete the experiment in a quiet and suitable environment to minimize sources of distraction. The 160 stimuli described above were then individually presented to the participants in a random order. Therefore, each participant was presented with each face 4 times, medical mask, cloth mask, book unoccluded. Participants rated the faces using the number keys 1 through 7, Likert scale from, I like this a lot to I don't like this a lot, or reverse. This is the actual example. So the face here of this person would change what exactly the face was, but they would stick the mask or the book or whatever it is in front of the face, and so they would have to be rating those. But there was 160 of them, which immediately gets me to my next question. How do you account for a lot of these? And I've never gotten a good answer for this. How do you account for the fact that some of the students would be, burned out? Because that's a lot to look at. That's 160 faces to look at and decide whether or not you're attractive, unless you're hoping, or you're telling them, we want you to respond quickly because we just want your initial gut, this is attractive, this is not attractive to me, kind of thing. So how do you do that when you're talking about 160? Do you get the burnout there? Do people get inattentive? And just because they're doing it on their own devices from the comfort of home doesn't mean you're not going to have distractions either. You can tell them not to, but we're also talking about college students. So it's not necessarily going to be no distractions involved. Let's see. finally, participants were debriefed and received course credit as compensation for their participation. Yeah, that happens quite frequently with studies that involve students. They have to be given, they are given some compensation for their participation, usually in the form of course credit. Let's see. Data were analyzed using a two-way repeated analysis of variance ANOVA test. So this is a basic test, actually, that you can learn in a basic statistics course of how to do an analysis of variance. So that's pretty straightforward. Can be applied in different ways. There's a few things here, and I definitely want to dwell on the figure on the next page, actually, and a few other things. The analysis did not reveal a statistically significant interaction between base attractiveness and occlusion, which is to say, there was no real interaction between those two variables. If you were occluded, it didn't affect the basic interaction that they had from the basic attractiveness that they had from the CRD database, CFDU database rather, that they had. But let's see. So this is the key kind of figure here, and we'll get to that in a second. Here, pairwise comparisons, Helm-Bonferrini corrected, were of the different occlusion conditions show that faces were rated as significantly more attractive in the medical mask condition compared to the cloth mask condition, p-value of 0.2, notebook occluder condition, p-value of less than 0.01, and control condition, p-value of 0.01. Okay. In addition, faces in the cloth mask condition were rated as significantly more attractive than the control condition, but they were not significantly more attractive than the notebook condition. Further, faces in the notebook condition were rated as significantly more attractive than the control condition. So I gotta say, what they're talking about is the comparison between these columns, effectively, here. But they did it by a pairwise analysis, which is to say, the individual participants, how did their rating change from the control condition for all those different faces that they looked at, compared to a mask condition, because they saw the same group of 40 faces, but represented 4 different times. And so that way they can look at it in pairs and do that analysis. There's something that bothers me with this, because you can look at the graphic up there, which is the mean attractiveness ratings for the occlusion conditions for the faces that were initially rated attractive or unattractive. The error bars shown plus or minus 1 standard error calculated from within participant variance. So the reason I don't buy the significance testing is because of these error bars right here. This is 1 standard deviation, right? And here, or 1 standard error. But the fact is that they actually overlap. All the standard errors are all these overlap. I can draw a line almost through and almost get to this one right here too from that particular condition. I think I can actually. It's just that I'm not drawing it very well right now. And likewise down here, you can actually overlap these. So there's actually overlap in the error. And this is 1 standard deviation. In your basic statistics class, typically speaking, 1 standard deviation corresponds to roughly about 66% confidence interval. Thereabouts. It's the empirical rule in statistics. It's part of basic statistics when you learn that. So that's a 66% confidence. If this were to go, usually when you see it, it's a 95% confidence or 99% confidence interval. Usually it's 95. It's the standard in a lot of studies. In particular, meteorology and climate studies, I know it is, and I've often seen it be the same in studies here. But in this case, with this, they're not showing you 2 standard deviations, which is what 95% tends to correspond to, is 2 standard deviations from the mean. And they're not, because in this case, they would almost entirely overlap if they did that in all of these, which suggests there's not as much significance here as they're claiming, which is another reason why I'm kind of like, I don't necessarily buy this. If I were to do tests on the significance of these columns, I don't think there would be that much significance here in terms of the average rating of attractiveness. So this is the mean attractiveness, right? Which is why this doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to me. These things don't agree with each other in reality. They seem contradictory to me because of the fact that the standard errors overlap so much. In particular, like the full face one, which is the no occlusion, overlaps entirely with the means of the notebook and the cloth mask one, and it touches at this one. And the same thing down here, where you get almost the same kind of thing. So I don't know. I don't necessarily agree that this is statistically significant the way this has been done. And it certainly isn't generalizable because the sample is all college students. So, I mean, it's something I have to point out. I hate having to point it out sometimes, but it's not very significant so far as I can tell. And the empirical rule in statistics suggests also that it is not half as significant as one would think. So, I'm doubtful of it. And this is where I would put it back to the authors and, your statistical significance test. How did you actually do that? And you know what? Maybe, I can get it. Ooh. So they actually did put a link in here for the actual data for this study, which, yeah, it's good practice to do. You should be able to find the data linked into a study if you can. Sometimes you can't for certain reasons relating to privacy laws and HIPAA in the US and all those kinds of things. Sometimes you can't find it, but here I could actually go and get the data and see if I could replicate this. So I may try and do that, and I will post the results of that exclusively for my locals members. Just to give you something interesting here and see if I can replicate the results here, because if I get the data and I know how to do ANOVA and the correction that they talk about here, those are statistical things. I know how to do them all. So if I get the data and I can do it myself, I will gladly do it. And I will say if I think these things are statistically significant or not. But I do not necessarily agree that they are. And I would like to see this analysis thrown out, done over again with 2 standard deviations here rather than 1 to give me the 95% confidence interval. And I think these would almost entirely overlap the means. So I doubt there's actual statistical significant difference between these means here. I could be wrong. I entirely invite the authors to say what they want to say and comment on it, but I don't necessarily agree that the statistical significance here is quite to the point. And like I said, I don't think you can generalize the results of this study because you were using college students in terms of rating facial attractiveness, and college students who've had to put up with the masks and been told, however long that the masks are the best thing and they have to wear it or to take care of people around them and all those kinds of other messages, as opposed to somebody who's not been in college the whole time. See, finally, participants showed high levels of agreement with the statements face masks have become a part of everyday life in the past year, and the spread of face masks the use of face masks is effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19. So there was significant agreement amongst the college students with those 2 statements. Yeah, and that's fine. This meant that investigating correlations of attractiveness differences with mask-wearing attitudes was not possible. Exactly. Again, this has to do with the fact that you have lots of college students that are doing this, not the representative of the general population of the UK, quite likely. Surprisingly, there was no evidence of a regression to the mean. Okay, the advantage for occluded faces is consistent with the general finding that inclusion improves attractiveness, which is surprising. While the present findings suggest that the cloth masks enhance facial attractiveness, there appears to be an advantage to medical masks beyond this. The advantage for a cloth mask can be attributed to the effect of occlusion, but the effect of the medical mask goes beyond just hiding undesirable features. It is possible that the additional advantage for medical masks comes from their association with medical professionals. And what they're getting at here is the social desirability thing. We spent a lot of the last couple of years putting medical professionals up on a pedestal, and in some ways rightly so. They put up with a lot of crap, and they did a lot of great work in the midst of this whole mess. And so I don't necessarily disagree that we can't put those medical professionals up there as good people. I have always said many times in this, always listen to your doctor. I am not giving medical advice. Your doctor is the one you should be talking to with respect to medical advice for yourself, because they know you better than anyone else in terms of your medical history. So go talk to your doctor if you need medical advice. But at the same time, the medical mask was associated with a medical professional we had so much positive press for so long that, yeah, I can understand that it's potentially giving a positive vibe for the mask itself, and making it more socially desirable. But I think it's also possible because the sample is just students who've also been told the same thing about, you got to wear a mask. You got to wear a mask to be a good citizen. You got to wear a mask to be protecting people. You're protecting people if you wear a mask, and so you want those positive things. So that's the social desirability amongst students, and particularly if there's a lot of peer pressure to be wearing those masks too. Let's see. While medical masks might prime disease, they can also be seen as a sign of being responsible and caring citizens, which it may positively impact perceived attractiveness. Yeah, that is again it there with the perceived attractiveness around there. But it's again also college students. I don't know if any, like I said, because this is all college students, I have no idea if this is actually representative of the general public. And they can't claim that either. They cannot claim that this is representative of the general public because of the primary focus was on 18 to 24-year-old college students. So I'm doubtful of the results, if only for that reason. But also doubtful, like I said, I don't necessarily agree that the statistical testing was done well or that graphic was done correctly, because those two things, the way this graphic is done and the way and the p-values in the test here are, shall we say, contradictory. They seem very contradictory to each other, and that's why I'm just like, something in me doesn't like how this was done. Let's see. Oh, and speaking of which, if you're ever wondering how to interpret these kinds of things, the way I think about a p-value that helps me think about it when I see it in a statistics test is a p-value is the likelihood the result that they got could have happened by chance. And when they say statistical significance for certain things, there's usually some threshold value. When the p-value is smaller than that threshold value, that's when they can say something about statistical significance. That's a very simplified way of talking about what the statistical test is that has to do with p-values. But that's what they're getting into here, is that just essentially the probability that something they found happened by chance. Which you have to be careful, because sometimes statistics can be used and abused. So that's a point to take in there. But a simple way to think about it, if you're ever wondering and you see a p-value, that's a good way to think about it, just in the sort of broad general term. The likelihood that some relationship somebody is talking about to you actually happened by chance, or some effective that someone is talking to you about it actually happened by chance. So, let's see. So the final thing here, this notion is in line with Oliveira La Rosa et al.'s research, 2020, which shows faces wearing medical masks are considered more likely to be ill, but also more socially desirable and trustworthy. So I guess in a way, one of the things you could argue is, from the logic of human psyche, you may be sick, but you're being a good, diligent person and trying not to get anybody else sick by wearing a mask. And so yes, we know you're sick, we see you're sick, but you're also socially you're also doing a good thing. We can trust you to be a good thing for the rest of society. That's the social desirability side of it. What if you're not sick, but you're just being ordered to wear a mask all the time? Or you're just being told you have to wear a mask in a building? False positive. If it's not true that you're sick, but you're being asked to wear a mask all the time, is that good? That's a more of a moral question than anything. For me, part of the reason I don't like it is just I don't need to wear it because I'm not sick. Kind of thing is one of the reasons I don't like it. The fact that the participants here reported favorable views on the effectiveness of masks in preventing the spread of COVID-19 adds weight to this possible explanation. It is possible that Miyazaki and Kawara's participants did not see the social responsibility element of mask wearing, and so the association with disease had a larger effect than the positive effects of medical mask wearing. There's something to be said for psychology studies and the like that. One of the things to consider with them is that they are very context dependent. What's going on at the time and around people, and so often it bears in mind that you should come back and check these questions over again, and whether or not it is socially desirable to wear a mask or it isn't, and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of context dependency with what's going on in the society when you're doing a study. And hence the reason they were asking about, what are your thoughts on COVID-19 and mask wearing and what have you. They were cognizant of that. So I give them credit for that. The final paragraph. From the results presented here and previous results, there appear to be at least 3 effects at play in the interaction between face masks and attractiveness. The sanitary mask effect is the reduction of facial attraction produced by the association between the mask and disease. This effect could be restricted to Japanese faces, and the COVID-19 pandemic has reduced its influence. The occlusion effect is the increase in attractiveness produced by simply by obscuring the lower part of the face. The effect can be produced by any object and is not dependent on a mask. A further medical mask effect is observed here, whereby medical masks increase facial attractiveness, maybe because the association of the masks with the medical or caring professions. This effect may only be present during the COVID-19 pandemic and so far has only been shown for male faces. Combinations of these three different effects are able to explain the disparate findings presented here and also previous research in the field. The exact relative contribution of these three effects across genders, cultures, and global health crises remains to be fully explored. Okay, so that's your classic boilerplate closing sentence here, or closing section. But as I said, this is one study where you need to look carefully at the how it was done, how the statistical analysis was done here, and to consider it carefully because of the issue with the sample being entirely college students, but also because you actually have the apparent contradiction between the p-values and significance testing and what the actual figure shows, that, it doesn't seem that there's a real significant difference at all when looking at the figures. So, if the authors do end up having a take on this and would like to address that, I would appreciate hearing about that, because I find the findings dubious, because I can see the somewhat contradiction that's there. But it's always good, as I've said, to go back and check the methods. But another thing you can look for is, what is a study actually generalizable? Could you reasonably make it generalizable to the public? And because this is focused primarily on college students in a sample, it doesn't really reflect the general public all that well, and what the general public may think about the attractiveness of face masks. It may reflect very well on what the population of college students in the UK think, or tend to think, let's put it that way, because they don't all think the same thing, of course. But it can't be reflective of somebody who's 50 or 60 years old, who's not there present. And as I said, they had a lot of people who agreed with the face mask being effective in stopping COVID-19 statements. So they had a lot of people who just already agreed that these were good things. And so you have to wonder, did you bias your sample in addition, with folks who were already predisposed to like the fact that you were wearing a mask because they're thinking you're doing your job as part of society or what have you, to actually save the day and do good things and all that jazz. So that's where I kind of find this study to be little odd and skeptical. And yeah, when you're reading a study, you can read the you can go in and read the introduction and the conclusions, and yeah, that gives you a nice overview and what have you, but it doesn't tell you, without looking at the methods and the analysis carefully, whether or not those conclusions are justified. And so I just make that point that, if you really want to see if a study is actually justified in what it does, then yeah, you need to go look at the conclusions and at the methods to see if the methods actually answer the question or support the conclusions, or if the results are actually generalizable or not. In this case, I do not presume them to be generalizable because of the fact that we're talking about college students, and they're trying to extrapolate what college students think to the rest of the general public of the United Kingdom, which I don't think is an appropriate thing to do. In the slightest at this point. I really don't think it's appropriate at all. But, so yeah, I think that's the general kind of gist of it. The other thing you can always look for in a study is that if it's funded by taxpayer dollars in most Western countries, in the US for sure, and in the UK, you have to find, there's usually something about the funding. Sometimes it's just in the acknowledgement section, but sometimes the journals require, putting information about funding here. Here they're saying they were not actually supported by any funding bodies. So this is something they did that was actually not a funded project. Though it was obvious here, if I'm looking at the ethics approval and other things, that, you can see, You can see other projects here were involved. It's just that they didn't directly fund the research of this project. So probably something that happened with this, and it does happen because it's happened to me before too, is that you're working on another project on a completely different question that's funded on taxpayer dollars, and then you accidentally stumble over something else, or you have the time and you go through and find something else. So it doesn't necessarily pay for your time, but you ended up finding something else in the process. So yeah, there's all those kinds of fascinating things that happen. Again, I apologize for the microphone. The microphone's a bit of a mess right now. I will eventually sort that out. I will see you all who are local supporters at 9 p.m. Central Time for the follow-up chat on all of this. And I will grab the other study on the pantyhose with masks too. So we can have a look at that too. But if you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, comment on the video. Let me know what you think. Do you think face masks make people more attractive to you? What do you think of this particular study? So with that, and next time, of course, come on over and join us on Locals. We're having more fun, and I'm adding more things in 2022 to be doing for supporters there exclusively and for Locals members. And like I said, I probably will go back and look at the data for this study and see if I can't replicate some of the stuff in here. And that will be something that goes up exclusively for Locals members. With all that said, I think that's it for now. Until next time, the next study review, there you go. There's a good thing. I almost forgot. If there is a study you would like me to review for you on this channel or go through with you, just go ahead and leave it in the comments section. I will try to get to it for you. And of course, if you are a local supporter, you get first dibs on any study that I go to review. And with that in mind, that's it for now. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you all stay curious, my friends.